welcome to another episode of the OYNB podcast. Today, I know how to say this, but this time I mean it. No, I say that too. We have a very special guest. It is my absolute pleasure to have Ronan Levy in the house. Ronan is a pioneering figure in the cannabis and psychedelics industry. Whoa, don't switch off yet. He's well known for his entrepreneurial spirit and passion for exploring non-ordinary states of consciousness and exploiting this grey area we talk about, which I just love. He has a background in law, a track record of founding some incredibly successful ventures like Field Trip Health and Canadian Cannabis Clinics. Ronan has shaped the mental health landscape, and he continues to do so. He's also the host of How We Evolve, the Non-Ordinary podcast, and the founder of the Non-Ordinary Therapy company, where he combines talk therapy and psychedelic experiences to facilitate personal growth and liberation. Now, as you know, I am very interested in the power of psychedelics to help people change their relationship with alcohol. So it's so exciting to have Ronan on this podcast and for us to get deep into the current science around psychedelics, the future of psychedelics, and what to do if you're curious about psychedelics. Well, without further ado, let's welcome Ronan to the podcast. So, Ronan, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing okay, but for my baritone voice by an impending cold, I'm doing good. But thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure chatting with you.
It's that time of year, is it? Is when the colds and the bugs. You've got kids, haven't you?
They do. I've managed to avoid them. Like there's probably been 3 colds that have gone through the house so far, and I've managed to resist. But this one got me.
Okay. Well, thank you for showing up anyway. And if there's any coughs and wheeze, we'll let you go. We'll be kind and gentle. So I am. This is going to be a ride, and it's going to be a ride because I know that this is a subject matter which divides people. I think there's an awful lot out there which people are fearful of, and this is the first time I've had somebody properly come on and talk about this thing called psychedelics. So it's an absolute honor. I've been watching you from afar, the amazing things that you've been doing, follower of your stuff on LinkedIn where you're very prevalent in your content and you're very unbiased. You've got lots of opinion. You've got a great voice on LinkedIn, worth following if you want to hear the latest stuff. So I've been watching you for afar and I was just like, I've got to get this man on the podcast so that we can lift the lid of this pseudoscience, crazy, unbelievable thing called psychedelic therapy, and have a proper discussion about it with real science. And also, to hear your amazing journey. Like going into research here has been like, wow, and then he did what? And then he's done who? And then like, you're a man on a mission. So I think let's start from the beginning, Ronan, and give us a little bit of a background. I know you started your career as a lawyer. So maybe just give us a bit of background into who you are and how you got interested in this psychedelic industry.
Sure. I'll try to keep it brief because I can make that a very long conversation. The funny thing is like growing up, I was a good Jewish kid. I tell the story that when I was about 6 or 7, my parents split up at a young age and the divorce was pretty acrimonious. So there were a lot of lawyers milling about my household at various points in my life. And I remember I was about 6 or 7 and some of the lawyers were at our house and one of them sat down and played the Commodore 64 with me. Now I'm dating myself when I talk about playing Commodore 64, but it's 64.
Me too.
Yeah. And he was a nice guy. And I told my mom, I think I want to be a lawyer when I grow up. And growing up in a good Jewish household, once you say that once, you're not allowed to forget it. I'm not home. And so, most of my young adult life was spent on that pursuit, high school, university for business school, but always with a path to get to law school, be a lawyer, get to law school, be a lawyer. But I've always had a bit of a devilish kind of contrarian streak in me. I've got, as a kid, I was a small kid with, I guess, a cute smile and a cute face. So like I could get away with shit that other people couldn't get to. I hope swearing's okay on the podcast.
Oh yeah, go for it.
And not suffer necessarily the consequences that friends like my friend Charles Panabaker would get. So I always had that kind of competing interest alive in me, which is stay the narrow course, to follow the path, get the good grades, get the job, and the rest is history. But then I also like to stir stuff up. So get to law school, show up on the first day of law school, look around, and I'm like, these are not my people. Like I have some wonderful friends from law school, but I could just tell they were on a path all about trying, keeping the status quo, risk aversion, straightforward. And I was just like, that's just not me. And so I stayed on as a lawyer. I finished law school. I became a practicing lawyer, hated my life for a good few years, and then slowly but surely worked my way into a career path which is much more suited to people of an inherently contrarian nature, entrepreneurship.
The unemployable.
The unemployable. The people who love hearing you can't do that. And actually, I asked the other day, and that's probably been my single biggest motivator in my life. People say you can't do that. I'm like, okay.
I just want to resonate with you there. Like this is hypothetical. It is not pathetic, but how important it is for me. I'll be at the airport and there's a no entry sign going down the gangplank, which is a shorter version. And I'll like walk backwards down the no entry sign. And my wife is like going, why do you have to be? And I was like, because the rule is so ridiculous. It's so silly. Like it's a shorter version. It's more efficient. I'm going down that route. So,
it's funny. Like I remember, I think it was at an airport, and they had those like little rope lines set up, and everybody was standing in the lines and not paying attention to I think like another booth was opened, right?
Yeah.
And just go straight there. And it's really amazing watching groupthink in action, especially when it's counterproductive. If anyone just stopped and said like, why am I following these lines that some complete random stranger put out, and I think it is appropriate for me to follow? But and the funny thing is, and I don't know, I guess you probably have this with your wife as well, but like, you forget that some people do think that way, right? It's hard to put.
Oh yeah, my wife is Swedish, right? So the Swedes just follow the rules. So she's actively looking for cues to join, and actively looking for the rules to follow. So yeah, it's like the polar opposite of me.
Exactly. Anyway, long story short, went to law school, decided entrepreneurship was my thing. As a recalcitrant lawyer, as a bit of a rebellious lawyer, I always had a thing for looking into areas where the rules were gray, because there's a lot of opportunity as an entrepreneur to wade into the gray area, especially, and this is important, if your philosophy and your ethic is good, right? Being like, there's a gray area there, and it can be exploited for good. It can also be exploited for bad, but completely exploited for good. And so I carved out a niche, kind of doing that stuff for a while. My first business was a cash for gold business, which I don't know about where you live, but here in Toronto, they are sketchy operators, right? They're all trying to take people for a ride. So we opened a cash for gold business focused on just transparency and honesty, being like, I'll test your gold in front of you. We'll weigh it. We'll show you our price. We'll offer. You can say yes or no. There's no negotiating. There's no haggling. There's no lowballing. It's just what it is. And it worked really well. But at the start, it's like, why would you want to get into the cash for gold industry? You were like a practicing lawyer on Bay Street, cash for gold. But I saw opportunity in that. And that thesis eventually led me to being introduced to who would become my business partners in Canadian Cannabis Clinics, Joseph and Hanan. And I was doing some legal work at the time, trying to help pay the bills because Toronto Gold, cash for gold business wasn't paying the bills yet. And I sat down and we jammed on some entrepreneurial ideas and all that kind of stuff. And I wasn't fond of any of them. And then just as I was going to leave, they're like, well, there was this one other opportunity. And I'm like, what's that? And they're like, well, the cannabis rules in Canada are changing. So there's an opportunity to create a marketplace. And I'm like, and why aren't you guys doing that? I'm like, cannabis, marijuana, it seems so sketchy. We don't use it. Like, we don't want to get involved with that. I'm like, guys, like just putting the entrepreneurial hat on, it's like you have a multi-billion-dollar market going from illegal to legal, literally overnight. You're creating this opportunity. And again, having that penchant for wading into that gray area and moving to themes where if you bring honesty and transparency, you can lift the whole industry. I was like, we got to do this. I said, if you guys aren't going to do it, I'm going to do it. So we joined forces, started a company called Canadian Cannabis Clinics. None of us were cannabis guys, not at all, which I think gave us a little bit of a leg up in terms of being seen as credible business operators.
And not being stoned.
Not being stoned, yeah. We did not have a constant supply of Doritos into our office. And we built what became the largest network of cannabis specialized medical clinics in Canada. We sold that to a company called Aurora Cannabis, which grew to become one of the largest providers of cannabis globally, and had a couple of really fun years working there where the cannabis markets took.
How many years was that?
Started in early 2014 and left in about 2018.
Wow.
And what happened?
Because whenever somebody, Ronan, says, I started a company and then we sold it, it's like, okay, I know what that journey takes. Like inside there's so much up, down, left, right, pain, sabotage, subterfuge, near-death experiences. Like that's the truth inside that little sentence.
We had the quintessential, I think it was the story of FedEx where the founder of FedEx had to go like take out all his money to make payroll just to keep the company alive and through the corner. We had that. We had signed the LOI with Aurora. They didn't have any money. We didn't have any money. So Joseph and I went to the bank and took out everything that we could to make payroll just to get us to closing. And it was the first time I'd never had anxiety over money. And that was the first time I was up all night being like, oh shit, if we don't close, then we're done, right? All that money that's put in is gone. It wasn't a huge sum of money, but it was enough for me at the time. But fortunately everything worked out and it turned out to be an incredible deal. And we had a hell of a lot of fun. And during that time, and this kind of parlays back to psychedelics, I got into the cannabis industry thinking that cannabis was medicine, right? I was like, and philosophically, if you want to smoke pot, cool, not my jam, but if you want to do that, that's cool, but let's not pretend it's medicine.
Okay.
And then through our clinics, the people who showed up every day were not, the skivvy stoner types. It was people who were genuinely sick, people who were genuinely suffering, in their 50s and 60s who had tried everything. And nothing had worked. And then they tried cannabis and almost uniformly they came back and they're like, that helped me so much more than anything I used, right? And sometimes it was like, it did nothing for my pain, but hell, I slept through the night for the first time in years and that's made a huge difference. And so it really shifted my perspective on plant medicine, right? Which I had put into quotes. I'm like, oh no, this is actually real medicine.
What were some of the things people were coming back and saying it's helped them with? So just touch on some of those.
Pain, anxiety. A lot of people came in, if they're going through chemo, the nausea and the discomfort, insomnia, epilepsy, sort of nervous system disorders like MS and all that kind of stuff. It was a very, very broad, and there's scientific rationale why cannabis helps so many different conditions, even that's across the body, is because we have a whole system in our body called the endocannabinoid system that's designed to respond to cannabinoids. Now, designed initially to respond to endogenous cannabinoids. Like if you've heard of the term the runner's high, that's partly a response of the endocannabinoid system working with endogenous cannabinoids. But phytocannabinoids, those that come out of plants, work well and help supplement the system. And that's all through your body. It's in every organ, every limb. So it kind of makes sense that, cannabis can be such a potent medicine across the board.
Is there other plants that have cannabinoids, phytocannabinoid?
There are hops, actually, that go into beer as phytocannabinoids in it. There are mosses that have phytocannabinoids in it. But cannabis is most.
It's a higher concentration. Is that why cannabis is more impactful than beer from a health perspective?
Totally. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And so right after we left the cannabis industry, we had started doing some investing and advising in startups and all that kind of stuff. And someone came into our office wanting to raise money for a company doing psilocybin therapy. And the person met with Joseph, and they came out of the meeting, and I wasn't in it. And I asked Joseph, I'm like, oh, who's that? And I was like, oh, she's trying to do something with psilocybin. And I'm like, psilocybin's a thing? I was like, I don't know. So we brought her back, and she told us what was going on. And she's like, Michael Pollan had just published the book, How to Change Your Mind. So it's 2017, 2018. MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, had just been granted breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA for its MDMA-assisted therapy trials. And the thing that really shifted my perspective was there's about 5 or 6 online stores openly selling psilocybin mushrooms in Canada. And when I looked into that, I was like, oh my God, the global zeitgeist has changed. The world has changed. Everybody's just catching up to the fact that the world has changed around psychedelics. And I was like, we got to do something. We got to do something in psychedelics. Again, much like cannabis, had never really tried psychedelics. So first thing we did is like, well, if we're going to do this, we should know what we're talking about. So
We should try some.
Yep. We went out and we each bought a gram of mushrooms and tried it in our office with actually Dr. Barry Weisglass, who was our medical director at Canadian Cannabis Clinics, because he was, an evolved hippie. He was in his late 60s, early 70s, but he was in the Woodstock era and his fair share of fun with psychedelics. And so he sat with us, and I was like, okay, I get it. It was just a gram of mushrooms. It wasn't terribly therapeutic, but it totally made sense why there's all this excitement around psychedelics. And so, on the back of that, Field Trip was born, and we took off on that journey.
Have you done a full hero dose of psilocybin, and tell us a bit about that?
I have. I've now done large doses of a number of psychedelics. So I've done a couple of large doses of psilocybin, one just with a local guide in Toronto. Through Field Trip, one of our clinics was in the Netherlands, where psilocybin truffles are legal. And so we had a clinic there. So I went there and did a full journey at Field Trip in the Netherlands. That clinic has since closed down. All of Field Trip mostly has since closed down, unfortunately. And I've done journeys with MDMA assisted therapy. I've done mescaline sessions. I've done 5-methoxy DMT, which is just overwhelmingly intense. I've tried LSD. So I've tried a handful. I haven't tried ayahuasca. I've done ketamine assisted therapy as well. I haven't tried ayahuasca. That's one that's on my list of things to experience. What's the experience like? It really depends on the drug, your state of mind. It's really hard to say, but the closest I can describe the experience on most psychedelics is like, that state when you're falling asleep, but you're still awake, you're still conscious, but you can feel your ego, your mind kind of letting go of control, and your thoughts start wandering, and colors and visuals kind of start showing up. It's kind of like that experience. By and large, you're still very much ketamine and 5-MeO-DMT are a little bit different, but with psilocybin, LSD, all of these, it's like you're still conscious. You can still sit up and figure things out and look at your phone if you want to. But actually, I have a podcast, and I had Professor David Nutt, who was
we had him on a few weeks ago. Yep.
And he was talking about what happens in the brain, on psilocybin, and how it causes certain parts of the brain to stop working. And those parts of the brain are what sort of integrate all the information into what becomes our experience. And when those things stop working, then you can understand why the visual effects happen, why the auditory effects happen. And you just find your mind so fluid and flexible and able to go so many places that, probably heretofore weren't possible. And it can be challenging, and it can be wonderful. It depends what comes up. There's that expression of trust, surrender, let go, which is like trust the experience, surrender, as much as possible, your control, and let go and go for the ride. And that seems to be where you get the best experiences, because you generate the most insights. Like in that very first instance, when we did 1 gram of mushrooms in our office, it was mostly just fun and funny. But I remember lying there, we had left Aurora, but there were still some things that were unresolved that were creating some tension with some of the senior management there. We looked at it and we said, I don't get it. Like, we've been professional, we've been transparent, we've been clear, we've been ethical. Why are they pissed off at us? And during that psilocybin journey, I was like, oh, I get it. And like I was, they talk about empathy as being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. During that first experience, I was able to put myself in their shoes. And I'm like, yeah, all the facts line up, but there's still some emotion there that is reasonable. And I felt it. And now I understand where they are. And it gave me a lot of compassion to be like, I still don't think we did anything wrong, but I can understand.
But I understand your perspective
for that. That's one of those moments where you're like, oh my God, this can be world changing. When if everyone could just get a little bit more of that sense of empathy, that sense of compassion, God, it would change the world, even if it's just 1% more the impact.
Absolutely. The solution to world peace is psychedelics. but I think that we get a long way there. The thing, I guess, for me, I've been in therapy, or was in therapy from 6 years old, counseling all my life, lots of talk therapy. So it was a natural evolution for me when I started to see a lot about Michael Pollan's amazing documentary now, turned the book into a documentary on Netflix, How to Change Your Mind. So it was a natural progression for me to seek out this. And, I would say that talk therapy is a bit like sitting down in a room with a complete stranger who you slowly build up some trust with over time, and you start to find some threads. And as you go to those threads, those natural defense mechanisms come into play. And the more ego you have, sometimes the more trauma you can have in the past, the quicker those defense mechanisms come in. And so you feel the emotion, you touch into it, you might get a tear or whatever, but bang, they come down. And then maybe you come back for another session and you try and get there again, or you go down a different path. And this goes over many, 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 many sessions. And psychedelic therapy is not like that. Psychedelic therapy, you open up the bag and you're like, woohoo, have all my stuff, and I'm just going to get it out in the room. That's how I found it. I was like, that's 40,000 hours of therapy in one session. I remember the very first, very intensive LSD and MDMA experience, the two combined that I did. I unpacked every corner of my mind during that day into the room with a trained therapist there sort of helping me understand it. It was so far beyond any other kind of therapy I'd experienced. So equally as excited as you are all those years ago, and I can understand why you wanted to go and build an organization around it. So very, very brave to get stuck into that. But I guess you'd gone into cannabis, seen that success with there, so you knew you were a pioneer in this front. So tell me a bit about this creation of Field Trip and the journey that you've been on there. I mean, it has had an amazing impact. I spoke to somebody the other day and they're like, ketamine therapy is available as an employee benefit in the US, and you can get it on your health insurance. And I know you were in part of that movement with that, and also helping do it. Like, just those words, that just shows how, guys, world, hey, we can't call this stigmatized anymore. We can't call this war on drugs anymore.
And actually, going back to the opening, I think you didn't use the word, but you said like this conversation is a bit divisive, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
I get it. In the absence of science, why people might find it divisive, but the science is tremendous. It always has been tremendous. That's the thing that becomes particularly frustrating when you think about it from a political and social perspective. Is like, since the 50s and 60s, LSD was one of the most studied drugs in the 50s and 60s. And then I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and this is not a conspiracy. It was for purely political reasons that the war on drugs was initiated, right? The communities who represented a threat to Nixon's administration were demonized, and they were demonized by choosing to focus on the drugs and ways that people reached ecstatic states in those communities. And that's very clear. You have Nixon, but you have Kissinger talking about it. It's well established. So it wasn't the science. But, fortunately, some pioneering people, and I always want to give them credit, Rick Doblin, who's the founder of MAPS, who started MAPS in 1986.
Wow.
Get MDMA rescheduled so it can be accessible.
Good Lord.
He's right at the cusp. They just announced the results of their second arm of their phase 3 clinical trial. And just not to put too fine a point on it, what their MDMA-assisted therapy protocol resulted in was something like 80% of participants who had chronic severe PTSD for I think an average of 15 or 16 years, 80% of them no longer met the criteria of having PTSD. And that actually improved over time. So we're talking about a near effective cure. It's hard to put a cure on anything that's mental health related, but that's as close as you're probably ever going to get, which is just amazing. And the standard of care up to that point was using antidepressants and conventional therapy to try and achieve a 30% improvement in symptoms versus an 80% cure rate. It's like, think how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people could have been helped between 1986 and now that are suffering with PTSD, whether from military action, sexual trauma, other forms of trauma. It's like the world would be different if that had never happened. It would be absolutely different.
It would be. Because there's the story of the co-founder of AA.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he believed that LSD was going to be the thing to help people change their relationship with alcohol, and the very reason he got kicked out of it. So Rick Doblin, Amanda Fielding, Professor David Nutt, who was just on your podcast and mine, these people were all the lights that kind of kept the light alive, and research resumed in earnest about 15 years ago, starting primarily at Johns Hopkins in the UK. And anyway, so we sat there and we're like, okay, let's do something in psychedelics. We're entrepreneurs. Let's figure something out. And unlike cannabis, where all the regulations had just changed, we're like, shit, what do we do? Like, nothing's legal. But slowly but surely started to peel back the onion and made some realization. So we realized that psychedelics are technically not illegal in Jamaica. And through our work in the cannabis industry, we had pretty good contact in Jamaica. So we're like, okay, well, why don't we just start researching psilocybin mushrooms? No one's really researching the mushrooms. All the clinical trials that are happening these days are on a synthetic form of psilocybin. So we set up a partnership with the University of West Indies in Jamaica, in Kingston, Jamaica, and started researching psilocybin mushrooms and had some pretty interesting breakthroughs. And then we realized that ketamine, which you touched on earlier, could be used like a psychedelic, and in some corners was being used like a psychedelic because the experience, even though it acts primarily on a different receptor system than classic psychedelics, it's a very psychedelic experience, and the mental health outcomes were impressive. And so that's where the dominant piece of what Field Trip got known for came from. We started opening up ketamine-assisted therapy clinics with a view to building the infrastructure, because we knew the likelihood of MDMA and psilocybin being approved for therapeutic uses was high. And that, because you'll hear the term set and setting throughout the context of psychedelics, you don't want to do a psychedelic assisted therapy session in a hospital with like fluorescent lights and frenetic energy. It just makes the likelihood of having a really challenging or scary experience higher. You want to do it in a safe, comfortable environment, and most doctors' offices aren't that. So how do you build a doctor's office that actually provides that space? And so that's what we started doing with Field Trip. We built 12 locations across North America and one in Europe, and provided ketamine-assisted therapy. And truthfully, as far as I know, we were generating the best mental health outcomes currently available anywhere in the world. On average, our clients were seeing their depression and anxiety scores go from severe to mild, and those benefits sustained for often 6 months or longer. And, you see similar results with MDMA and psilocybin, but those aren't currently available. So we're generating truly amazing results. And then the third piece of Field Trip was, as wonderful as psilocybin and MDMA are as medicines, doesn't mean we can't do better. Create more efficient medicines, safer medicines. One of the big challenges with psychedelic assisted therapy is the journeys are a long time. In MDMA assisted therapy, you're in the office for 6, 8, 10 hours. It's a long time. Can you deliver similar results in half the time? And so we started a drug development division, which became known as Reunion Neuroscience, focused on developing novel psychedelics that address some of the more practical limitations of classic psychedelics from a medical perspective. I just think it's very interesting, the whole development there and the improvements of the substances themselves. But I think there's probably a bit of division there because I understand the need to reduce down the time of it. But at the end of the day, these things are growing in the field. For they're readily available. They're in the field. And, I think from that perspective, it can help an awful lot of people versus the pharmaceuticals trying to get a hold of it and turn it into some kind of drug. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I share that concern in theory. I am one of those people who believes that psychedelics should not be medicalized. You don't need a doctor involved in this. I'd say I wouldn't bring my rabbi if I was having heart surgery. So why would I bring in doctors who what is often some of the most spiritual and emotional experiences that a person may have? So I recognize that concern. I personally don't think practically that happens, right? The war on drugs, the U.S. primarily has spent over $1 trillion and 60 years and millions of lives trying to fight the war on drugs, and the use of drugs are at all-time highs worldwide. So it's like, it's not going away. You can try and bury it. You can try and put it into a corner, but we're not going to repeat the 60s, it's just not going to happen with the internet and the way the world is. I'm not too worried about it. So can pharmaceuticals try and squeeze out, the natural products? Sure they could, but I don't think they're going to be effective. We see cannabis as a shining example of how plant-based medicine can still shine in the world of pharmaceuticals. But I do think there's a lot of people who like the notion of something that's gone through a clinical trial and it's synthetically developed.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like,
got a stamp on it.
Yeah, so I think we're better off where people have the choice between natural, non-medical, and synthetic, more medical. And I think that probably will create the right balance, but we'll have to just watch and see.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea of that balance, that it's up to the individual to choose. So let's talk about some of the latest science, the latest research. So somebody who's listening is just not convinced. I mean, maybe they've heard this before, like, look at some of these substances. You talked about an 86%, over 80%, almost elimination of PTSD using MDMA-assisted therapy. And so, let's talk about some of the latest research in these different substances. So, what are we seeing?
Sure. So I think a good place to start is just talking about the safety profile. So what Professor David Nutt is probably most known for was he was the chair of the UK Council on the Misuse of Drugs, basically an organization to set up drug policy in the UK and try and stamp out drug use. And credit to him, he's like, well, I'm not coming in with a idealistic approach to it. I'm going to come in with a scientific approach. So let's look at what the science says in terms of what the harm of drugs are. And so they analyzed on a multi-criteria basis many known illicit narcotics, as well as certain pharmaceutical compounds to assess the relative harms. And top of the list in terms of the most harmful was alcohol. Bottom of the list in terms of the least harmful, in terms of harm to self and harm to others, was psilocybin. And then shortly above psilocybin was LSD and MDMA and ketamine. So all these drugs that had been demonized, that we'd been told are going to fry your brain, or dare to not do drugs campaigns, turned out to be the safest. I mean, they're not totally risk-free, but they have very low harm profiles. In terms of toxicity, it's almost impossible to overdose on most classic psychedelics. They are not only not addictive, as evidenced by the AA story, they're anti-addictive in many cases.
Yeah, that's what many people have said to me. Like, I don't want to swap one drug for another. I don't want to have alcohol and the next minute find I'm snuffling truffles in the back garden.
That's exactly right. I have heard people say, like, you're just swapping one for the other, but it's not. It's like, swapping a McDonald's burger for, a grass-fed steak and a salad. It's like, yeah, they're both food. So we have a very high safety profile, and that safety profile has borne out. So let's just go back to the MAP study. So the latest results, which I just shared with you, are the end of the clinical trial phase. So MAPS is preparing a submission to the FDA and expects that MDMA will be approved for the treatment of PTSD early next year, early 2024.
Amazing.
So, and in that study, I think they reported no severe adverse events, which means no one had a significantly negative experience. Now, again, like, there's conversation about that. How do you define a severe adverse event, especially when you look at therapy plus drugs and all that kind of stuff? But overall, if you just look at it as a drug, almost no harm. Psilocybin is the next most progressed in terms of the classic psychedelics approval, Compass Pathways and another organization called USONA are both about to commence their phase 3 trials for psilocybin-assisted therapy. And what the results with psilocybin show is, there's been some studies that suggest that a single psilocybin-assisted therapy session can improve depression scores for up to 4 years or longer. They did a trial looking at people suffering with existential dread because they had a terminal diagnosis, and the improvements went out 4+ years, and the improvements are significant. So really impressive stuff. Again, high safety profile. Just being fully honest, in the Compass Pathways trials, there were some severe adverse events, and those were for a couple of participants. Suicidal ideation happened shortly after their psilocybin-assisted therapy experience. So in some ways, it kind of made them worse. But you can't look at that on its face alone. And I've spoken to a number of people that were involved with it. What happened was the people in that trial, they had treatment-resistant depression, so they tried other forms of drugs. And they were the ones who didn't respond to the psilocybin. And so what happened is you had these people going into the trial with a lot of hope that this was going to be the thing because nothing else worked, and they didn't respond very well. And so you can understand how that may create a negative impact. But the actual drug itself and the experience, there was generally no harm associated with that. So, and then ketamine, just so everyone's aware, and you said this before, it's currently legal and available. Many people have a negative association with ketamine, which is completely unwarranted. Ketamine is actually one of, I think, 7 medicines identified by the United Nations, or maybe known as the World Health Organization, as being an essential medicine for most jurisdictions because it is so safe relative to most anesthetics. It had been initially approved as an anesthetic because it doesn't suppress the central nervous system. So with most traditional general anesthetics, it suppresses the nervous system. So if you overdo it, you can basically put yourself to sleep for good. There's almost no risk of that associated with ketamine, and they found the mental health benefits of ketamine from using it as an anesthetic, that many people who had received it as an anesthetic also reported significant mental health improvements. And so they started following that thread of research. It's so safe, in fact, that if you have children and say one of them breaks a bone and you take them to emerge and the doctor has to reset that bone, odds are they're going to give your kid ketamine as an anesthetic as opposed to anything else. So it really puts the safety profile in clarity. Now, with ketamine, it does have a higher risk of dependence. Some people can use it too much. And if you use it too much, it can create bladder-related issues, but that is really from consistent, regular use. If you're using it as a psychedelic, which is intermittent, occasional psychedelic-assisted therapy sessions, there's almost no risk associated with it.
Let's pause just for a brief moment. I just want to share with you some of the heartfelt feedback from our incredible Complete Control community members. Listen to this.
I don't know how I signed up. I think I just got an ad on Instagram and just got a whim, just hit the button and did a call and then signed up and didn't really consciously think much about it. And then after that, I was like, what did I just sign up for? Wait a second here. Far exceeded my expectations. I'm usually extremely skeptical, so I don't know how I even signed up in the first place, but whatever it was. So it's just amazing how the transformation that I've seen, and even the drinking part is just kind of it was the Achilles heel, but it's kind of just the superficial problem. And it's once I kind of clear that up, there's so much more possibility. And the exploration discussions with Gary, with Candace have just been so powerful, and they both kind of focus on a different area. And then with Glenn kind of looking at my data, and with my cohorts or classmates, or, it's just been everything has just been so powerful and kind of supportive of, completing the whole picture of how I do this. So just really grateful and yeah. And also just feel more grateful, and not only just for all of you, but just in life in general. It's just a little bit more clarity and peace and calm and so forth. So
I am incredibly grateful for this entire program, everybody on this call, and everything that we were able to experience. I think that it delivered more than I expected. Honestly, I like I've said before, I've done a couple of like challenges and different things, and I think that this, beyond examining my relationship with alcohol and making, I think, pretty good strides in staying alcohol free. I think it taught me a ton about myself and how to like examine my habits and my thoughts and those kind of patterns and ways to approach the things that worried me the most in this experience have just been invaluable. I think I'm leaving feeling stronger in general, more self-aware in general, and just really more anchored in who I want to be and what my values are and how I can, take better steps to achieve those. So it's been fantastic for me. And then again, our team, I really appreciate all the feedback and support from every single person on this call, but my cohort as well. It's been great.
So I love everybody that I've met here. I have loved the program. I am not an emotional person like this, but this has changed my life. It has given me a life. And there's other things I need to do too. But I don't have to do alcohol anymore. So thank you.
It's been an amazing journey and I appreciate the professionalism. Whenever I feel the stress, there's something that I can go back to everybody and the sharing from everybody and the professionalism of the program. So I loved it and I've grown a lot. So, ups and kisses.
One word is transformational. That's a word that's been bandied about for decades, but in this, it is absolutely accurate. If I was to use one word, this was a great investment. It's not self-help, it's self-realization. It's super powerful, but it exceeded my expectations. Or maybe it was Sharon who said that. Or maybe I'm exceeding my expectations, and I like that.
I mean, the program has been I'm hugely grateful for the program. I think the journey for myself has been amazing. I mean, I remember telling, I don't know if it was Candace or Gary, the first 3 or 4 weeks of the program, I was like, I can't stop thinking about not drinking. It's in my head. Every day I'm thinking about not drinking. And it's like now I'm not even thinking about it. It's just like my life has sort of stepped on. I'm excited about the future. Things are looking good.
I just love sharing the things people are saying about our complete control program. Okay, let's get back into the episode. So, what would you say to somebody who is thinking about having a psychedelic experience or just putting a toe into this water, or what does somebody do to take the next step?
Yeah, so I'll do a shameless plug right now. So myself and Dr. Mike Dow, who's a psychologist and a nutritionist, wrote a book called The Ketamine Breakthrough. So if you're interested in learning anything about ketamine-assisted therapy, definitely check out the Ketamine Breakthrough. It has a ton of resources that's applicable. It's specifically written for ketamine-assisted therapy, but truthfully, it's applicable to just about any psychedelic-assisted therapy session. If you're thinking about this, the important thing is to do your research, make sure you're comfortable and know what you're getting into, because these experiences can be intense. I remember growing up in high school, all the concerns around the bad trip. Don't do the brown acid, you'll have a bad trip. Just so everyone understands, generally speaking, the consensus seems to be that there's no such thing as a bad trip per se, which means when you have a psychedelic experience, you can have easy experiences, which are positive, loving, all sorts of nice emotions, or challenging experience, which bring up more scary emotions that we don't like to feel: hurt, sadness, anger, etc. Properly supported, most challenging experiences actually can be the most cathartic, can create the biggest breakthroughs, because people are confronting the things that they don't want to confront. They're going into their shadow. And so they're not a bad trip per se. They're just challenging when they're properly supported, and it can actually turn very positive on the other side. If you're not properly supported, then a challenging trip can become a bad trip, and then that can create its own kind of traumatic experience. And so, what should you be thinking about? It's like, do your research, understand it, as much as this is an emotional and a spiritual experience. And I think that's what creates the impact. You do need to satisfy that worrying mind that we all have. And then I think the important things are find a trusted guide, preferably a therapist, but not necessarily someone who has a lot of experience taking people through these journeys and knows how to support you. Make sure whatever you're taking is clean. Generally with psilocybin mushrooms, you don't have to worry about it too much, but with MDMA or any synthetics, in this day and age, you want to make sure that there's no risk of any, it being cut with fentanyl or xylazine or anything along those lines. And then, make sure you're doing it in a place where you feel comfortable and you do some prep work. You go in with an intention. That intention could be just like, I just want to see what happens, and that's perfectly fine. But do some thinking about what you want the experience to be. And if you do all of that, then you're setting yourself up to have a really positive experience that, for many people, change their lives in a significantly positive way.
Amazing. And okay, what do you looking ahead for, what you're up to, and also what's happening in the world out there? What does the future look like to you?
So as it pertains to psychedelics, we're going to see our first approved psychedelic early next year with MDMA. Psilocybin's probably a year or two later. And I think there's going to be more and more happening. At the same time, we see regulation changing. So Colorado and Oregon have both created programs to provide legal access to either psilocybin or plant-based medicine. So it's not FDA approved. It's a much more flexible model, much like you see with medical cannabis programs around the world. And that's going to continue. California is on the verge of decriminalizing psychedelics, and most.
Well, Australia have won the race here, right? Australia have already.
Yeah, I always forget about Australia. They have they rescheduled psilocybin and MDMA, so they're now prescribable by doctors, and some doctors are prescribing it. I expect you'll see Canada, much like it did for cannabis, create a program where it becomes accessible through a medicalized program, but not necessarily a Health Canada pharmaceutical program. And that's just going to continue around the world. And, we joked a little bit about psychedelics being a panacea that's going to solve all the world's problems. I don't think that's the case, but as one of my teachers points out, it's like even a 1 degree shift. If you think about what happens with a 1 degree shift over time, if you start here and you go 1 degree over a couple of years, you're very far from where you would have been otherwise. And so small shifts can have massive impact over time. And I think that we're going to see that happen quite a bit. And that's tremendously exciting to me. I think more than ever, one of the things we didn't talk about, we talked about the more medical applications, but what we didn't talk about and doesn't get enough credit these days, and my bad for not reading it, is in addition to, all of these potent effects treating depression, anxiety, etc. Psychedelics also have pro-social side effects, so people actually have more empathy and compassion following a psychedelic experience, tend to be creativity enhancing. So people tend to be more creative. People have more concern for the planet. These are all qualities and characteristics that I think the world can't get enough of. I don't think we have too much. I don't think we have too much compassion. And that's all part of it. And so the more psychedelics become more mainstream, I think the better the world's going to be.
So when can I launch my MDMA beer?
Depends on your risk tolerance, mate.
Should I just ship you some? We just privately amongst friends for now, like prohibition.
Absolutely. I mean, listen, that's been happening for quite some time. It's, something has gone kind of mainstream when we have a place up, a couple hours north of Toronto in farm country. And some of the farmers up there be like, oh, yeah, I drive across to Eastern Ontario and sit ayahuasca with a shaman once or twice a year. And I'm like, okay, farmers are kind of moving out of this.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is very interesting, but we didn't touch too much on alcohol, is there much research in specific around addiction and alcohol and changing your relationship with alcohol? And I'm asking that facetiously, but you tell me.
Yes, there is. It's still not quite as well established. There's a lot of research early on in the 60s and 70s looking at psilocybin-assisted therapy for the treatment of smoking cessation, and it was highly, highly effective in terms of treating smoking addiction. There is a lot of research around alcohol, like the AA foundations. There's a company that actually Professor David Nutt, I think, is an advisor for, called Awaken. And I think they've got a protocol for using ketamine-assisted therapy for the treatment of alcohol use disorder approved, and they've shown like tremendous outcomes. 50 to 60% total cessation of alcohol use or substantial reduction. And unlike some other treatments, which can be awful, and these tend to be really positive present experiences. So there's a lot of interest. Ibogaine, which is a psychedelic I haven't tried and we haven't talked about yet, but it's from...
I have.
Oh, do tell.
It's like a sledgehammer. So ayahuasca is known as the mother, and ayahuasca for me was a lot of suffering, and I went through hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of suffering, and once I came out the other side of it, the realization, just like you said about ayahuasca or some of these things, is that you realize after, is I realized that this is the suffering I put myself under every day, all day, with the beating up and the self-criticism and the lack of self-worth and all of those things. And it was acting out as this pain inside. And I wasn't in any pain. It was just this own psychological pain. So it was a huge shift for me. When I went through Iboga, Iboga was 36 hours. It's a 36-hour trip. For 30 hours of that, I was going back through memories. And you talk about empathy. So I was seeing memories from a different perspective. I was seeing them from where I went wrong, or where I made a mistake, or where I made a judgment too quickly. And so I came out of it with probably 40 people to get in touch with. I mean, I called people I went to school with and said, hey, I haven't spoken to you for 30 years, but I just want to say, do you remember this moment? They're like, no, what are you talking about? Or, yeah. And I was like, look, I just want to apologize because I saw that. It was amazing. It was really, really amazing. So I think, I highly recommend all of these experiences. I'm a massive advocate of psychedelic therapy. I'm very excited about where it's going, and I'm trying to understand it in depth myself first before pushing it out to the world more. But the thing I think you were telling me about Ibogaine, so please do tell me, because I think what's fascinating about Ibogaine is, I don't remember her name in particular, but I think in 1991 she filed for clinical research around Ibogaine, and specifically in addiction. And you've got many trials of people being very severe addiction and having one experience with Iboga and just never touching it again.
Yeah, specifically with opioids, right? That's where there's a lot of excitement around Ibogaine treatment. And it's really hard to get off opioids. The addiction power of those is incredible. So that's very exciting as well. It's not as well researched as, say, psilocybin or MDMA, but it's coming along. And, I know some people who run a great clinic in Mexico called Beyond with Ibogaine-assisted therapy, and they're generating tremendous results. Again, it's like with Ibogaine, you got to be a little bit careful because the risk of cardiotoxicity is higher. That's the one risk of like overusing psychedelics on an individual basis. Doesn't matter, but overusing because they work on the serotonin system. So the thing that causes the trip is the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. The 5-H2B serotonin receptor, if it's agonized too much, can create cardiotoxicity or cardiac valve hardening. So if anyone remembers a drug called fen-phen many years ago, that was the issue with fen-phen, is it agonized the 2B. But that's only really a risk if you're taking it every single day for extended periods. If you're doing it intermittently, it's not a real concern. But with Ibogaine, it's a little bit of a higher concern. So if you're doing Ibogaine, you probably want to make sure you've got medical supervision present in the off chance that something does go sideways.
Yeah. Well, I heard that it was a lady who was on David Nutt's podcast, and she personally was part of the team who investigated all of the deaths in Ibogaine, and they found pre-existing heart conditions in all of them. So I think it's important to look at that. It was 13. I think there's been since the 1990s. So again, but you look at statistics and data, people are like, oh my God, why do you do that? But we have all these other drugs. I mean, sorry, how many people have died from alcohol, disease, liver, car crashes, accident? I mean, I spoke to a woman earlier who, anyway, I'm not going to mention it, but yeah, so it's what we rationalize as what is safe and what isn't is hilarious. So we were about to touch on what you're up to next. I'm very excited to hear about what impact you're planning to have.
That's still a fluid conversation. Still trying to stay very close to the psychedelic industry or space. Doing some advising with some companies. I've started advising a company called Safe Supply, which is investing in really trying to end the drugs. So not specifically psychedelics, but changing the whole ecosystem. And they're doing some cool work with the coca plant and investing in technologies to ensure the safety of the provenance of the drug supply. So if you are going to do cocaine or MDMA and it's not from a trusted source, you can test it to make sure it's not laced with anything. So really, I think important work, not necessarily as flowery and positive as we get with psychedelics and all of the tremendous impact it can have, but still important work that needs to be done. And then, actually one of the things I'm working on with Joseph, who is my business partners from Field Trip, we've started a new company called More Interesting Ventures, which was inspired by the quote from Hemingway, which is, I drink to make other people more interesting. Because he and I, we enjoy the benefits of alcohol, which is the conviviality and ease of socialization, but the impacts are so painful. And so our goal is to hopefully find a way to develop a non-alcohol functional beverage that offers an effect substantially similar to alcohol without all of the negative side effects. And so that's one of the things I'm excited by, because it's solving a person 100%. Well, no, it is not nearly as fun right now, to be quite honest, because I don't drink. And so if there's a way to provide that lubrication without the impact, man, it would be a wonderful thing for me.
MDMA beer. Imagine going in, to a restaurant and being offered an MDMA cocktail with your wife and just feeling love and harmony, connection, and all that wonderfulness in an evening. And just how different that would be to be drinking alcohol. But really excited to hear about, I'm a big advocate of the functional drinks area. I think, alcohol-free drinks is super helpful for lots of people. But as long as we live in the absolute insane society, very stressed with all of this doom and gloom, wars and everything else constantly attacking us, and social media and everything else, our central nervous systems are going to be stressed out, and we're going to look for something to take the edge off. Until we teach everyone to meditate and do breath work all day, then that's going to be the case. So being able to give people something functional that helps with that, I think, is really important. And I think we're right at the early stage of that. I know Professor David Nutt has been working on Alcarel, his synthetic substance. And so any work going into here, and I was at number 10 Downing Street 2 or 3 months ago. I met the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and this was my comment was, we need to heavily subsidize the functional drinks market, because the cost of alcohol and the significance of it. And plus, I know you probably don't want to hear this, but if we heavily subsidized and penalized with an extra tax the alcohol industry, but incentivized them to really come up with these solutions, we see this transition happen so much faster. A lot less deaths, a lot less suicides, a lot less families broken up. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Ronan. Where do people find more of you?
If you want to follow me on socials, it's Ronan D. Levy, D as in David. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, etc. If you want to listen to my podcast, I've gone deep. We didn't touch on it. I could have taken it down there, but I'm kind of going deep on, exploring. It's not just masculinity, but kind of masculinity, like as a middle-aged man, trying to get a sense of what I value. Because for so much of my life, I've just been focused on the professional pursuits and realized that That's a payday that doesn't actually create the rewards you want. So how do we find, success and meaning in a different way? That's not specific to men, but, because that's my experience, that's the one I'm focused on. So that podcast is called How We Evolve. And so if you want to listen to that, that's on Spotify, everywhere else. And if you want to check out the Ketamine Breakthrough, that would be awesome. It's on Amazon and a regular book.
Super, super cool. You're an absolute star. Keep focusing on those gray areas and pioneering new things. We need people like you with good intentions going into those areas and creating and being a force for change. So yeah, thanks. And I'm super happy to support your work and super happy to support what you're doing. Thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure. And I want to thank you as well for the opportunity to be here and all the work you're doing.